Hi, I'm John Kundtz, and this is a recording of a presentation I made to the Lakewood Historical Society's annual meeting of membership at the Church of the Ascension in Lakewood. The presentation was given on Wednesday, April 30th, 2025, and is entitled The Life and Times of Theodor Joseph Kundtz. I am the great-grandson of Theodor and self-appointed family archivist and historian. I also host the Disruptor Podcast and am a blogger and a nonprofit board advisor. Today's agenda: how did we get here? Our family tree, Metzenseifen, where it is, and why can't I find it on a map? Since we're presenting in Lakewood, I'd like to spend some time talking about the Kundtz Castle, a Lakewood legacy. Then we'll shift gears and move back to Cleveland, looking at the late 19th century looked like, particularly as it was a time of growth and expansion for Theodor Kuntz's company. And then we'll discuss More Than Sewing Machine. Theodor Kundtz Company made a lot of things, but in today's presentation, we are going to focus on the church furniture legacy. A number of years ago, our family hired someone to go to Metzenseifen to research our family tree. We traced Theodor Kuntz's great-grandparents, Michael and Katharina, who lived around the 1760s. That would be my fourth great-grandparents, who had a son named Ionis. Ionis is essentially German or Hungarian for John. He married Anna. They had a son named Joseph, who married Teresa, and Joseph had Theodore. Then in 1874, Maria and Theodore were married in Cleveland. From 1887 to 1910, Maria and Theodore had 10 children. 6 of them are pictured here: Ewald, my grandfather, Angie, Irene, Dorothy, Marie, and Leo. On June 15, 1926, Betty O'Neill married Ewald. They had 4 children: Louise, Ewald Jr., J. Andrew, my father, and David. My children represent the 5th generation of Kuntzes living in Cleveland. Let's take a trip to a town called Metzenseifen. Metzenseifen was founded in the 1300s by German-speaking immigrants. This picture, taken around the 1890s, shows what Metzenseifen looked like then. It's not much different today. In the background are the Carpathian Mountains. On the other side was technically Germany, which is why many residents, including my great-grandfather, spoke German. In the foreground is the church, the center of town in a quaint village in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Before World War I, Metzenseifen was near the German border, but it was technically in Hungary. It was roughly about 25 kilometers from Kosice and not too far from Vienna, Bratislava, and Budapest. Today, Metzenseifen is called Medzev and is part of the Slovak Republic. Mary Queen of Angels Catholic Church appears to be the spiritual and physical center of the town in this 1910 picture. The church is on the left. In the background, you can see the town cemetery, which still has descendants and cousins of Theodore buried in it. Medzev is still a small town in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains. Here are some recent pictures taken by a friend of the family. The first one is Medzev looking east. You can see the mountains in the background. On the upper right-hand corner is the Mary Queen of Angels Church. There's a view of the cemetery in the lower left-hand corner. The last picture in the lower right-hand corner is typical of a village house in Medzev, similar to where Theodore or his family grew up. Their house is no longer there, likely destroyed during a flood shortly after he emigrated to the United States. Speaking of that, in April 1873, Theodor traveled from his home in Metzenseifen across Austria and Germany, ultimately to the French port of Havre, and he boarded the SS Denmark. The SS Denmark was not what you'd call a speedy, ocean-going vessel. It was quite slow, turning an already long trip even longer. Theodore, without money, wasn't in a luxury class, so his trip was likely 3 or more weeks in cramped, dirty, unsanitized quarters with limited food and not a lot of facilities, so to speak. So while Theodore crossed the Atlantic Ocean from France to New York, let's take a look at the Kundtz Castle. The Kundtz Castle was a staple landmark in Lakewood from 1903 to 1961. Let's deconstruct the castle's legacy. First, we'll discuss its architecture, then delve into both the interior and the exterior. We'll explore what we think the life on the estate might look like. Unfortunately, all things come to an end. We'll discuss the sale of the castle to the Murrow family and its ultimate demolition in the 1960s. Lastly, we'll cover the rise of Kirtland Lane, which was the property's redevelopment. Here is a 1914 Cuyahoga County map showing the Kundtz property at 13826 Lake Avenue in the upper right-hand corner. This picture is a blow-up showing it turned perpendicular, going west on the top and east on the bottom. You can see the property and from Lake Avenue to Lake Erie. A number of years ago, the Lakewood Historical Society sent me some copies, and they currently have in their archives the original blueprints for the castle. And here I'll show you one of them, the original staircase blueprint. From the blueprint, you can see the design, the architecture, and the woodworking that Theodore called his mark. He essentially took his cabinet makers and his craftsmen and developed the entire interior of the house. Here's a picture of that staircase taken years ago when the family was still living there. You can see the ornate architecture, beautiful woodworking and furniture of this master staircase. Moving to the outside of the castle, here's an original tower blueprint from the Lakewood Historical Society. And here is a picture of the finished tower. And you can see it matches the blueprint extensively. My dad used to tell stories about visiting his grandmother there. He doesn't remember visiting when his grandfather was alive, but he would visit his grandmother, Maria, and roam the castle. There was a bowling alley in the basement, and he would mess around with that. When he got bored setting the pins up manually, he would go up into the castle tower. It's about a 3-story tower, maybe 4 if you count pinnacle. You could crawl up to the top and look out towards the lake. This picture shows the southern side of the tower. If you looked out this window at the tower, you'd be looking towards Lake Avenue. But if you went to the other side of the tower, you'd have a marvelous view of Lake Erie. Here's the original carriage porch blueprint. This was the front of the house. The house was built when few people had automobiles. So this is where you drive your horse-drawn coach or horseless carriage, park, and enter the house. Here is an artist's rendition with the porch. It shows the magnificent wraparound porch that starts in the front, goes to the eastern side, and then around the northern side of the house. So let's move on and take a quick look at some of the exterior features. Here is a wonderful aerial photograph from the Margaret Manor Butler collection at the Lakewood Historical Society, dated about 1934. At this point, Theodore and his family had lived in the house for close to 30 years. Here is a picture of what they called the carriage house, but it really was actually a barn with stables, stalls, horses, and cows in it, in its own right, a beautiful house. And the family lived there during the construction of the castle that wasn't completed until 1903. Here is a postcard of the house pointing it to the house and the grounds moving on. Here's a picture of the north side of the house facing the lake. You can see the window up in the tower, third floor, must have had spectacular views of Lake Erie. This picture was probably taken fairly early after the completion of the construction because the landscaping is still immature and the trees are still young and they haven't grown up like you saw in the aerial photographs earlier. Moving towards the east side of the house, and you can see the entrance to the gardens or grass. And then you can see the north side of the wraparound porch, which we saw from that picture before. It started in the front, went to the side, and is now in the back. Moving to the front of the house, or the south side, facing Lake Avenue, you see the porches again, the tower, the carriage porch, where you would come and drop off and park your car. And then here's another picture taken a bit later based on the maturity of the trees, and starting to see some vines on the carriage porch. It looks like winter, giving a perspective of what it looked like from Lake Avenue as you drove into the driveway. Let's shift gears to the interior. Here's a picture of Maria and Theodor inside their house. And next to them is an example of the room and furniture in the house. As you can see, there's beautiful furniture, beautiful woodworking. It's a little ornate, in my opinion. One of the things noted in the house is that there were these murals, and I'll show you some pictures of them. But you had these murals that went from the top of the windows to the ceiling, some beautiful murals on the ceiling itself. We'll look at those in a second. Going back to the woman at the bottom of the staircase from the previous slide, now I have a picture taken a little later in color. You could see in more detail the woodworking, the craftsmanship. Looks like the same chair in this picture. If you walk up the stairs, you see the woodwork throughout the house. If we take a quick turn around and look down the stairs, you can see, I believe that is probably the front entrance, or certainly an entrance. You can start to see some paintings and furniture in the woodworking. Here's more of the interior of the house. You can see the furniture and the woodwork. Each room had different types of wood, got very detailed and pretty. One last picture of a lamp and a table, and another interior picture with murals I referenced earlier. Here's a ceiling mural and one of the dining room murals. I love this one because it shows them eating breakfast. This could be when they were living in the barn while the castle was being built. There's a horse visiting. It's a cool picture. I would love to know if this mural was ever. So let's take a quick look at what life on the estate looked like. Here is a larger picture from the Margaret Manor Butler collection from the Lakewood Historical Society. This picture was taken in 1934, discovered in the Lakewood Historical Archives by Greg Sent, and it's fantastic. It's a view that in my 66 years I've never seen before. It shows not only the castle and the grounds, but the paths down to the lake. Most pictures from our family albums were from ground level. Here's a great example of a picture of the beach on the lake. This is one of the few properties in Lakewood with direct access down to the lake. Most of the lakeshore is very high cliffs. This property had a little beach that you could walk the grounds down to the beach. There was a pump house that pumped water up to the house, and they would host picnics and cookouts down at the beach. And there's some swimming areas in the lake as well. It must have been spectacular on a beautiful Cleveland summer day. There were paths from the house to the lake. To the right, you'd go down to the beach. The path to the upper left, where the bench is, leads to a cliff overlooking the lake. Eventually, they built what they called the roundhouse at the top. Here's a picture of Theodore. In front of it, he has his cane. So this was after the factory accident that injured his leg. And after that, he always walked with that cane. But if we take another view of the roundhouse from the shore shows it at the top cliff. You can see the swimming area from the aerial photo. It would have been a spectacular place to enjoy an adult beverage on a beautiful summer night watching the sunset over Lake Erie. Here is a picture of Joe, Ted, and Ewald in front of the castle. I have dated this picture somewhere around 1907 based on the relative age of Joe and Ewald. My grandfather Ewald was born in 1901, and his brother Joe was born in 1902. They appear to be roughly 5, 6, or 7 in this picture, dating it to around 1907 timeframe. Here is another picture identified around 1910 of Maria and Theodore in front of their house. Here's a blow up to give you a better perspective of their outfits. I think they really embraced the culture of the United States. I asked my dad if he remembers talking with his grandmother, and he said she had no accent. Her English was very good. They spent a good bit of time learning English and assimilating into the United States as a prominent business couple trying to maintain Hungarian roots. Here is a family picture around the 1920s. You can see Theodore and Maria in the front and the rest of the children in birth order. Not pictured is their first child, Joseph Peter, who unfortunately only lived to 2. I believe he died during one of the flu epidemics of the late 19th century. After that, Ted was born. He was called Theodore Jr., but he had a different middle name. He was the oldest surviving son of Theodore and Maria. Then came Marie, Ted's sister. Also not pictured is William Joseph, a special needs child with developmental disabilities, and did not live with the family. He lived in Chicago, Illinois. Then my grandfather Ewald, followed by his brother Joe, born 12 months later. Next was Irene. And then Angie, his younger brother Leo, and the youngest Dorothy. As the saying goes, all good things must eventually come to an end. Now let's talk about the sale and the end of the era. The time frame is 1945 to 1961. The sale of the castle, the one last look, the public open house in 1960, and the eventual demolition of the Kundtz Castle. The Kundtz family's long association with the Lakewood estate ended in 1945 when the property was sold to Robert Murrow for $60,000. Here is a picture from 1955 after the Murrows bought the property and about 5 to 6 years before they demolished the house. After Theodore died, Maria lived in the house by herself. It was actually at the time when my dad, now 92, and his brother Ewald, now 96, remember going to visit the house and visiting their grandmother there. It was a lot of upkeep. The children were grown, married, and were moved on and had their own houses. Some in Lakewood and some like my grandparents and his youngest sister, Dorothy, on the east side. It became overwhelming for Maria to care for it alone, so they sold it in 1945. Under the Murrow ownership, the mansion gained the new nickname of Murrow Castle. Unfortunately, around 1960, the castle and the surrounding land was acquired by the Eggleston Development Company for $110,000. Murrow realized the castle was an overwhelming undertaking to maintain, and it had unfortunately outlived its useful life. The developer's intent was to redevelop the 5-acre property into a new residential subdivision consisting of 16 custom-built homes. Before closing this chapter, the Murrows and the developers allowed one last celebration of the historic home, what they called a public open house. On December 18th, 1960, the Cleveland Plain Dealer published an article entitled "Last Look, Then the castle will crumble. They published smaller advertisements inviting the open inspection Saturday and Sunday afternoon, December 17th and 18th. Plans, pictures, architecture sketches will be shown of the luxury homes in the new development at that time known as New England Drive. Then the cranes came, the wrecking balls came. This Cleveland Press photo from March 8th, 1961 of the wrecking company tearing down the house. All that's left at this point is the tower. Then the following morning on March 9th, 1961, the Cleveland Plain Dealer published this photo of the castle falling with the caption, "The tower falls with a crash." The house is now gone. This is a photograph and the corresponding article in the Cleveland Press, March 8th, 1961. And all it says is gone. With the demolition of the gingerbread tower comes to an end one era in Lakewood and starts a new one. The West Side Realty Company will build 16 homes in the $50,000 to $100,000 range in the area to be known as Edgewater Estates. It's always been referred to in our family as the rise of Kirtland Lane, the redevelopment of the property. Here is a June 22nd, 1962 Cleveland Press article. We're about a year and a half after the demolition. Bob Brennan, the real estate writer for the Cleveland Press, published an article entitled "Castle Memory Lingers in Kirtland Lane Homes." He included a few pictures. The first home occupied on Kirtland Lane is listed as an air-conditioned New England model bought by Carlisle and Laura Milner. Landscaping here was installed last week. Here is a picture of the original model home for Kirtland Lane. It's listed as a brick and frame home, has 4 fireplaces, first floor utility room, kitchen, and family room. Here is an interior picture of the Carlisle Milner's home entitled "Spacious Setting for Relaxation." This next picture is entitled "3 Levels Face the Lake." This is the rear of the home being built at 1041 Kirtland Lane for James Stouffer's of Stouffer's Restaurant. It will have a traditional front elevation with an attractive 2-car garage. The home will have living and dining rooms, kitchen, breakfast room, library, bedroom, and bath on the main level, plus 4 bedrooms and 2 baths on the second floor. Basement level consists of a family room, patio, barbecue, and a boat storage room. This picture is entitled "Southern Colonial is among the variety of early American homes on Kirtland Lane." This home has a library on the first floor, a circular stairway, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and a den on the second floor. And wrapping up here is an aerial photo of Kirtland Lane. Most of the homes have been built. Kirtland Lane runs down the middle of the property, and the cul-de-sac is probably where the original house stood. Let's shift gears to Cleveland in the late 19th century. This was a growth and expansion era for not only the city of Cleveland and Midwest manufacturing, including the Theodor Kundtz Company. This picture shows the Cauga River, and the brown area is called the Irishtown Bend. It used to be called the Irishtown Bend neighborhood and redeveloped into a park. Margaret Lynch, an archivist for the Irish American Archives Society, found that Irishtown Bend had not only Irish, but a whole bunch of Hungarians. When she was looking at the census, realized that many of the people in the census records listed their native country as Hungary. What struck her was many of those residents listed their occupation as cabinet maker, woodworker, craftsman, factory worker, machinist. The Irishtown Bend initially attracted skilled and semi-skilled workers of Irish descent, but over time, more Hungarians moved and lived in Irishtown Bend. The rationale is because it was within walking distance of the Theodor Kundtz Company, which is shown on the map. The original sewing machine cabinet works was at 122 and 124 Elm Street. Irishtown Bend has another significance. There's a residence there at 41 Franklin Avenue, significant because Theodore took up residence there in the Irishtown Bend neighborhood when he arrived in Cleveland. He was on the boat from France. He arrived in New York. At that time, Ellis Island was not in operation, so he emigrated quickly into the United States. He got on a train and headed for Cleveland. But to give you some perspective of this picture, shows Columbus Road and Riverbed Street, which is still there today. Then right behind it, between the row of houses on the yellow line, would have been Franklin Avenue. At the top of the picture, you can see this church, which is the St. Emmerich Church. But right here in this box with 3 two-story and 3-window wide houses is what we believe is Franklin Avenue. And therefore, we believe Theodore lived in one of those houses, most likely the first one on the left. If you Google 41 Franklin Avenue, you won't find it. The city of Cleveland renumbered the streets not only once, but twice. This address doesn't exist because it was replaced in the early 20th century. Margaret Lynch and her brother did a triangulation work and pinpointed this location where Theodore resided, his wife, some of his siblings or cousins and other relatives when they all first moved to Cleveland. Moving down the river towards the lake, we see a picture of the Theodor Kundtz Company. His cabinet work was set up for 122 and 124 Elm Street in 1878. He took over the space from a bankrupt sewing machine company. In fact, he actually worked for that bankrupt sewing machine company. Even though Metzenseifen was known for metallurgy and ironworks, they had cabinet makers there, and we believe Theodore's father might have been a cabinet maker, giving Theodore an apprenticeship in his early teens. This allowed him and gave him the skill he needed to work for the Cleveland Sewing Machine Company. When the company couldn't pay him, he took his pay in the form of equity and later bought them out, renaming it the Theodor Kundtz Company. Here's a picture from 1879, company photograph taken in front of the factory. We believe everyone is from Metzenseifen. Almost everyone would consider themselves Hungarian. You can see from this picture, there are 2 sewing machines. Theodore is the gentleman with the hat in the middle, not looking at the camera. There's some young employees at the top left-hand side of this picture, but they were all proud of what they were doing. The company had really started to grow. Here is a picture of the Superior Viaduct around 1885. And at this point, you can see the cabinet works, what they call Plant 1 on the far left with the box. The lumber yard in the flats in the early 1880s shows that the business was starting to grow. A lot of people, a lot of wood. He also had a lumber yard in Lakewood, which is a subject of another discussion because apparently it was one of the most notorious fires in northeastern Ohio. Still talked about it by some elders of the community. Then around 1910, the Detroit Superior Bridge opened. You can see the 5 plants in the upper right-hand corner, the viaduct and the new bridge over in the flats. You can sort of see where the powerhouse is today. Since I am giving this presentation in a church, I thought we'd spend some time talking about church furniture. Theodore was known mostly for sewing machines, and that was certainly his core business, but it wasn't his only business. Theodore expanded into more diversified manufacturing over the years. By the late 1870s through the 1880s, sewing machines was the business. The good news was that by 1879, for all intents and purposes, He was the sole supplier for the White Sewing Machine Company. Sewing machines were very popular and considered pieces of furniture. These machines were expensive and prominently displayed in parlors and living rooms. By 1887, Plant 1, which took up the block of Washington Center, Elm, and Winslow Streets in the Flats, was solely dedicated to making sewing machines. Shortly thereafter, Theodor got into the school furniture business, which he branded as Eclipse. He actually got into it by request. The Cleveland Board of Education needed a local supplier they could trust and asked him to make furniture, which Plant 2 then produced school furniture and eventually church furniture. Beyond Eclipse school furniture, there was the bicycle rim business called Kundtz Bending. In 1897, Theodor was granted a patent, number 596424, for wooden wheel rims. Now, Theodor already had about 40 patents, mostly for sewing machines, but this shows how he got into the business in the late 1890s. I've seen advertisements from European cycling magazines from 1904 into the 1920s. These rims were considered high-end, relatively expensive, used by performance riders like France quality riders, and they were quite popular in Europe. He also was in the truck and automobile body business. Plant 3 was dedicated to manufacturing automobile bodies for Winton, White, Peerless, Stearns, and Murray companies. Truck and automobile bodies made of wood were eventually overtaken by steel in the 1900s. He also was in the stadium and auditorium seat business, an offshoot of the school furniture business. By 1930-31, Theodor Kundtz had supplied 62,781 chairs to the new Cleveland Municipal Stadium. If you've ever sat in that old stadium, and those seats were manufactured in Cleveland by Theodor Kundtz. He also made seats for other stadiums, including Boston and other older stadiums. Unfortunately, when they tore down the municipal stadium, they didn't save any of the seats. If anybody has one, I'm sure the Lakewood Historical Society would be happy to accept it. They're hard to find, but an interesting artifact for Theodor's business. Let's move on to the church furniture legacy, a natural expansion of the school furniture business. He didn't organically grow the business. He acquired our church furniture company around 1909. It was founded by George Vorbauer, who apparently was a fellow practitioner at St. Rose's Catholic Church. And the story goes that George was aging, his health was failing, and he wanted to get out, and he sold the business to Theodor. Shortly thereafter, started to see advertising brochures showcase Theodor Kundtz church furniture, like one entitled Da Vinci's Last Supper. What I find fascinating about the church furniture business allowed him to take his artistry, craftsmanship, and cabinet making skills to really expand it and utilize the true talent. The school furniture business is boring, not a lot of room for beautiful hand carvings and elaborate woodworking. It's very utilitarian and functional. But the church furniture business is different, as shown by this beautifully carved in wood version of Da Vinci's Last Supper. Another couple of brochures advertise what he calls the Kundtz craftsmanship, and the furniture and the pews designed and built by Kundtz craftsmen. At one time, more than 5,000 churches in 48 states had handcrafted woodwork from the Theodor Kundtz Company. I picked up a 1916 church furniture catalog. Here is the cover of it. And in the title page, there were two pictures of the factory. The first one says, "The factories cover 4 blocks." The second says, "Over 30 acres of hardware lumber." By 1916, Theodor Kundtz Company had grown and expanded. Here are examples of church furniture from the 1916 catalog. Here's pew end number 114, altar number 12, tri-seat number 576, and high pulpit 389. That takes us to the Church of the Ascension. Here is a picture of my 92-year-old dad in front of the church when we visited after Greg had uncovered some wonderful artifacts tying the current furniture in the church to the Theodor Kundtz Company. Here is a letter dated April 19th, 1916. It's a letter to Reverend Wallace Gordon, presumably the rector of the church, inquiring about providing church furniture. In May 13th, 1916, a letter to R.H. Wilcock, who was listed in other documentation as the chair of the building committee. Essentially, this is a letter acknowledging the fact that they are going to respond with a proposal for the church's needs. And what ties this all out is that on February 16th, 1918, we have a copy of an invoice that definitely shows that business had been conducted between Theodor Kundtz Company and the Church of the Ascension. Let's take a quick look at the current pulpit, the craftsmanship, the choir pews, and the church pews. And then one last letter dated May 21st, 1918 was a letter to Mr. R.H. Wilcock again, acknowledging the payment of $1,590 and, of course, thanking the church for their business. The sales cycle went from inquiry to proposal to invoicing to payment. Summing it up, Theodor Kundtz thanked the church for their business, and I thank you and the Historical Society and the church for allowing me to pontificate on the life and times of Theodor Kundtz. I'm John Kundtz, host of this special edition of the Disruptor Podcast. Take care. Have a great day.